Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 dialogue session of the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. My name is Dr. Angela Anderson, and I am a Canadian architectural historian. I'm speaking to you from the territories of the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt and Wasanich peoples, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I am an associate editor with the journal, and it is my pleasure to serve as a host for this, which is the fifth iteration of dialogues on the topic building the vernacular and the everyday in Islamic contexts. And I would like to welcome all of you joining us today and in the future as well. And to warmly welcome the three exceptional and talented contributors to the field of architecture with whom we are fortunate to be able to speak today. So welcome, everybody. So the International Journal of Islamic Architecture published its first issue in 2012 with Intellect Press and has continued to print rigorously edited and peer-reviewed articles that focus on urban planning, architecture, landscape architecture, design, social dynamics, and the reception of the built environment within the historic and contemporary Islamic world. The emphasis rests on analysis of the practical, historical, and theoretical aspects of architecture in a global context, and the journal also encourages dialogue between practitioners and scholars and discussion of emerging areas of study within the field. So if you and your colleagues are interested in publishing with Intellect, you can, and the journal, the International Journal of Islamic Architecture, you can find information on the website. The Dialogues series is the International Journal of Islamic Architecture's annual roundtable, in which we bring together scholars and practitioners from varied disciplines and hold a discussion on critical contemporary issues that interrogate the boundaries between architecture, art, anthropology, archaeology, geography, sociology, and history. You can find the recordings of the Dialogues series on the IJIA YouTube channel, and the edited discussions appear in the first issue, annual issue of the journal each year. I have been examining the interface between architecture designed by architects and master builders and architecture created by and improvised for users for some time. Spaces are constructed and adjusted by and for the community according to need. Place-based design, the agency of women, children, and the elderly over dwellings and communal spaces, and the buildings erected to facilitate learning, worship, festivals, and ritual shape much of the built environment in Islamic communities. Self-built and self-adapted spaces are constructed by the community, and commercial spaces, schools, housing, and streetscapes are shaped by designers and users to better meet the specific needs of local people. Settings for assembly are made, adapted, and reshaped, sometimes on a temporary basis, and investigations of these design practices can broaden our understanding of spatial needs and intentions. We can question whether the vernacular label, often used to refer to local building traditions, but also non-monumental sites in general, is a useful categorization for localized traditions or the contemporary revival of local practices, and why in some contexts and institutional settings, vernacular design and the architecture of the everyday continues to be presented as if it is less meaningful or thoughtful than institutionally guided and canonical projects. There are many ways to engage space and place-based design needs. Communal spaces and sites are erected to, as I said, facilitate learning, worship, festivals, ritual, and daily life. So in this year's session, I will ask panelists Yasaman Ismaili, Hussein Kashani, and Suleiman Salahi a series of questions to guide our discussion on the idea of the vernacular and the everyday in Islamic contexts, how current needs act to shift and adapt these traditions, and how the digital realm intersects with local brick and stone. Yaseman Esmaili is an architect and educator based in Tehran, Iran, and Boston in the United States. In 2018, she founded the award-winning Studio Chahar, which serves as a platform that fosters cultural expression, innovation, and community participation through collaborative architectural processes. Yasman is a recipient of the Tammuz Women in Architecture Rising Star and University of Washington Graduate of the Last Decade or Gold Awards, and her work was shortlisted for the Aga Khan Award in 2022 and won the 2018 Global Silver and 2017 Gold Awards from Lafarge Holcim. Hussein Kashani is Associate Professor and Program Coordinator in Art History and Visual Culture at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan in Kelowna, Canada. He is a specialist in Delhi Sultanate and Awadhi visual cultures and digital art history, and he is currently working on a manuscript which is tentatively titled Entangled Visions, Gender, Sexuality, and the Visual Spatial Culture of Awadh, India. And Suleiman Salahi is a civil engineer and Fulbright scholar based in Seattle in the United States. With over a decade of international experience in project and program management, he specializes in infrastructure development and construction and sustainable design. Suleiman is a recipient of the Janet Ketchum Award and has been involved in creating safe learning environments for girls through sustainable educational infrastructure in Afghanistan. So welcome to our panelists today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So the first question that I have for you is, what does the term vernacular mean for you? How have you encountered it in architectural contexts, and how do you approach the idea of the vernacular in your work? Or do you prefer an alternate way of describing vernaculars, or how you view vernaculars, or the buildings of the everyday? So I think we can maybe start with Yasaman, and each of you can respond to that question.
Sure. Thank you so much for the introductions. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation, and I think it's going to be a very, very exciting discussion, very important topics for the day, for what's happening today in the world of architecture. I think with the word itself, vernacular, sometimes, as you mentioned, there is this tendency of relating it to the meaning of being a little bit primitive or less complicated. That's something that I have encountered, and in that way of thinking, instead of trying to redefine the word through the meaning of contextual or extension of existing cultures and ways of how things are being done for generations, and how it can be redefined and renovated, I think it's a better way to define it. So if we can define it, then we can use the word, but that's how I see the meaning. And in terms of how it appears in projects, I think it starts by observation, meaning that if you can observe without having preconceptions about what's happening around you in any local setting that you're working at, and try to gather information about history and culture, and then define the problem and find answers for that. And I think with that, I will let the next participants to add.
Suleiman, would you like to go next?
Sure. So yeah, likewise, thank you for inviting me to this distinguished panel roundtable. The way Yasaman said, I also wanted to say that the word vernacular is actually, I find it interesting, super interesting, and it's actually very near and dear to me, because first I was actually born and raised in part of a world, Afghanistan, where there was a lot of fabrics of vernacular design patterns around me outside of the city skirts. But at the same time, to me, vernacular also means a connection between culture uh, and essentially architecture. So vernacular architecture isn't just about preserving local identity. to me, it also offers smart, sustainable solutions for today's challenges. And when I say sustainable, I mean using local material and essentially traditional methods and means that make sense environmentally, economically, and obviously culturally. Uh, a lot of the time, this approach actually leads to buildings that are more energy efficient, have a smaller environmental footprint, and are naturally better suited to the needs of local communities. So just think about techniques like brick masonry, stone masonry, stud mod. These methods have been around for decades for a reason. And I'm actually not an architect by profession, but from time to time, when I'm invited to design meetings for projects that are actually back home, vernacular to me means connecting design techniques. And with that, I would conclude.
No, yeah, thank you both for those very stimulating responses, and I look forward to the rest of our conversation. Thank you, Angela, for organizing this. My initial response is as a student of architectural history, and I thought back to my classroom experiences when I first encountered the vernacular, and I would often encounter it in counterpoint to the monumental. But more generally, the notion was a generic, all-encompassing category. So versus specific individual monuments we would study. So it was, this anonymous, amorphous category versus these, superstar buildings. And so that has always been one way that the idea of the vernacular was imprinted upon me, rightfully or wrongfully. The Like everyone, it's typically the distinction between the cost of the materials, right, is one kind of division line between the two. So anonymity, costs, and then the other way it was taught to me was the response or relationship to climate, that there was something deep, some kind of embedded climate knowledge in the vernacular traditions that may or may not be more present in specific monumental cases. And as I did my own research in northern India, and I found the distinctions not very particularly helpful, because in the different periods I worked on, Delhi Sultanate and Awadh, there's such a continuity between the vernacular traditions and the monumental traditions. And I think, in our contemporary world, that spectrum, that continuity, going from the small scale structure to the monumental is one of the things that's been so significantly disrupted.
Thank you all. These are really interesting responses, and I think it indicates that the vernacular is a concept that we're all familiar with, but we encounter it in very different ways. And so there's not a sort of single agreed upon understanding of what it actually means, and yet we can use it in our own work to try to understand architecture in different contexts. So it has some sort of role for us, which maybe we can continue to define and parse as we go along today. And so the next question that I have for you is how there are so many sources and examples of regional architectures, which you have all mentioned, including field studies and lived experience and private archives that are digitized for educational use. So there's no lack of material to examine vernacular architecture. But with this in mind, why do you think that there has been such a long-standing scholarly tendency to either overlook vernacular spaces or to distinguish them from other kinds of spaces in Islamic quote unquote architecture specifically, and then the accompanying challenges of trying to teach this idea of the vernacular and in specific examples of vernacular architecture in both design programs and art history programs. So Hussein, why don't we begin with you, because I think your response from your last question leads into this a little bit.
Yeah, sure. As an architectural historian, I can definitely see that the field skews towards the textual record. And when we look for evidence in the textual record about buildings, means there's an inherent bias towards those who record history. And so I think from those who write about architecture historically, there is this kind of inherent pull towards the monumental that is recorded by courtly elites and court chroniclers. And I think that's kind of one source of gravity, if you like. I think the other thing is that the Euro-American ideology of art and aesthetics, which is very influential in my particular field, has privileged works that can lend itself to conversations of providing some kind of superior transcendence and some kind of higher value, spiritual, mental, what have you. And it becomes difficult to talk about the vernacular in those terms. And so you have this historic divide between art, high art, fine art, and craft that I think our conversations fall prey to. The final point I'd make is that we are in the business of teaching interesting things to students as myself as an academic, and there is, of course, an inclination to have showstoppers or works that attract a kind of audience. If we think about the teaching of art and architectural history as an enterprise that is dependent on student interests, then there's this again this pull towards the monument, which is the quickest and shortest way to attract interest. So those are some of the thoughts circulating in my head.
Thank you, Hussein. I think also as an instructor, I think I agree with that, and it's actually more challenging to have students engage with questions about history and society when they're looking at a mud brick house, for example. We can do it, but it's not the same kind of response from students usually. So it takes more effort in some ways. Yasaman, what are your thoughts about that question?
I mean, I totally agree with what you were talking about, Hossein, and I think there is something about also, the places the locations that we define as where there is the Islamic architecture. There is also a disconnect in terms of geography and politics that doesn't allow the complete exchange of knowledge. There is so many resources about what you would call as local, traditional, vernacular, contextual architecture that, for example, you could find in a library in Tehran, like in the public library of Tehran, that would never, it has never been translated, at least for the last 50 years or so, in any other languages. And also the other part of this is, even if it's translated or even if it's written, many of it is written by Western scholars, where if it's only a Western scholar and if there isn't an exchange while it's being recorded with the locals, there's always a lack of true identification of what is being recorded. And I mean, that applies to any kind of local tradition that you want to have it recorded. And many times they're also looked upon as ways of living of the past, which is not true, because there are still many contexts and settings that it has been a way of living in the past and it still continues. And that's why it's connected between the less monumental and monumental. Even this definition of, monumental versus ordinary, I don't think, for example, applies in many, like Safavid architecture in Iran, for example, because there is such a continuous connection with the way that architecture is defined in its module as a housing versus its module as a central mosque versus what you get as the palace. It's not that, the thinking, like, it's a system that repeats itself. So I do think there's a huge gap in translation, which politics play a big role, because when you look at the relationships between countries in different eras, the way that architecture is studied also changes. Like if I, for example, talk to somebody who has studied architecture 50 years ago, they might have a lot more knowledge about, like what is it about the architecture in Iran versus if I, and I have taken history classes in the US, or I have been a TA for history classes. So I think that plays a big role. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was also that the way that we document, like the Iranian architecture has been documented for generations, is also not the Western way of documentation. But many of it is, word of mouth. It's through memories. It has been translated between generations, and many times that's not accepted in the way that we want to write about it in the Western publications. So or the way like that the standards are defined. So I think I see these as some of the big challenges that we are facing.
So I think that's me now. Yeah, I actually fully agree to what's been discussed so far. Hossein brought up great points. So did Yasaman. I think there could be a few contributing factors that actually drive the tendency to overlook essentially vernacular architecture. Like Hussein mentioned, bias, like colonial and Orientalist bias, for instance. You mentioned about the Euro-American way of thinking, essentially focusing on monumental structures, excuse me, mosques and palaces in comparison, or rather than everyday spaces. And when I say everyday spaces, I mean like courtyards in traditional homes, like bazaars and covered market streets. Another example is the roadside inns, or AKA caravanserais. That's also sometimes overlooked in comparison to other larger, more significant monuments. Another example is like hammams, public baths, for instance. The other contributing factor, I think, is the institutionalized architectural narratives. So design and history curricula often emphasizes on canonical work over the living or evolving traditions, basically sidelining local narratives, which are informal, and that way they don't get their voice spread out. Yasaman mentioned about lack of documentation, which I fully agree. I think vernacular architecture is often adaptive, making it harder to document compared to formalized structures with written records. And one other point that I wanted to mention is urbanization and globalization. Essentially, rapid modernization has devalued one way or another traditional practices, leading to a focus on contemporary and international styles over local and indigenous everyday design. So I think with that, the challenge in teaching these examples lies in shifting architectural education and research towards recognizing the intelligence and sustainability aspects embedded in the vernacular practices, rather as relics of the past. I think that's the challenge that all designers, the whole community, the whole design build communities is facing, especially in eastern side of the world.
Thank you very much. So our next question is connected, I think, to this part of the discussion. I'm interested in what you think about what happens when vernacular environments, built environments, and not just individual structures, but entire communities often they're either lost to time or intentional urban reconfigurations, introduction of new infrastructure. And this leaves communities without direct access to examples of vernacular approaches. So what happens when this access to visual information can only be provided by archives or by, as Yaseman says, the community memory or oral descriptions of previously existing built environments? So maybe, Suleiman, would you like to continue with your thoughts, and then we can go to Yaseman and Hussein?
Sure. I think one important point that's actually embedded in the question is intentional urban reconfiguration. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, coming from Afghanistan, where essentially that country has been conflict zone for the past few decades. War and conflict could be interpreted, at least to my understanding, as an intentional urban reconfiguration. So destruction of the built environment, particularly in conflict zones, actually poses a significant threat to cultural heritage. Just one example would be the destruction of the Buddha statue in the central city of Bamyan that I actually got to travel years ago in early 2000. That's just one example. With that said, we should not also forget that when there are communities that have suffered from years and in some cases decades of war and conflict, essentially what happens is a gap forms. Basically, from my experience in back in Afghanistan, when we talk about vernacular design patterns or construction methods and techniques, so there's a grandfather, there's a father, and there's a son, and that's how the information is shared or transferred through generations. Unfortunately, one ramification of war is not only the destruction of physical infrastructures and archives and whatnot, it's also the destruction of people. People lose their lives, and essentially that's how there's a gap. That vernacular patterns are not transferred to today's age. I guess there could be multiple solutions to this dilemma. The ones that I wanted to pinpoint is, so we live in 21st century. On a higher level, it's up to local governments and nonprofit organizations and institutions to sort of like leverage the cloud-based archive systems to basically archive these practices. But on a more granular level, I want to say that it's up to the design build community to enhance the awareness of the local best practices, materials, and design patterns. And I think this way we will be able to do our part and essentially help communities that are recovering from distractions or disasters to shape their culture and essentially heritage.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will start by adding to the point that Suleiman made about heritages, that I think it's important to remember that when we talk about spaces and monuments or anything that we define as heritage, it's something that belongs to the whole world. So it's not only for that place. So the first thing that happens is that when it's gone for everybody. Something from our past, from our global culture is lost. And then, I think there are so many things that happens, and there are good scenarios not very good scenarios or very, very bad scenarios. For example, you know, if you have, because usually what happens is that then you want to, if that's removed, you want to go for imitating a model from another part of the world where you can use that model to show that you are very advanced and you're modern, and you are, you know, you have a face that shows as a very contemporary face. So if you have access to enough infrastructure, you might achieve that, but with the price that you look like not that place. Like you could move that community and put it anywhere in the world. It doesn't necessarily belong to any place. It's just a global location. But I think the thing that happens is that usually you don't actually have that infrastructure. You don't have access to create that infrastructure first. So even though you might end up seeing these communities or cities that are created and they look very luxurious or fancy, they decay very fast. They can't really sustain their existence. So after a decade, after a few years, basically they end up decaying and leaving the community without anything. So the identity is gone, and the built environment also can't really respond to the needs because it's not built according to the needs. It's just built according pictures of the Pinterest or pictures from Pinterest or architectural journals. And there's, you know, that complete disconnect between what has been there for hundreds and thousands of years and what has been happening for the last 50 years or, you know, but even like 5 years or 10 years.
Yeah, thinking about North India and the Suleiman's comments about the disruption, the loss of life, the politics of the vernacular, and maintaining architectural traditions in shifting political military realities is, I think, something that so much of the Islamic world knows. And in North India, we see that um, vernacular architecture, which might be sort of used as a basis of identity for one community, may no longer serve as the same reservoir of identity for a dominant political community. So the significance, what the vernacular signifies to the communities that are engaging with them is so crucial. And uh, what the other speakers were talking about really got me thinking about how we really can't think about the vernacular solely as tangible culture, but but we have to think about it as the intangible culture that is part and parcel of it, right? The ways of living, the design build cultures, and what does one do to deal with significant disruptions and ruptures caused by the processes of human history? I think we can only talk about some kind of selective, knowledgeable reclamation and interpretation, right? But it needs to be a mindful one as opposed to uh, um, one that is ungrounded. Otherwise, it won't take root again.
Thank you all for those thoughtful responses. And I think too what people are referring to a little bit is the mining of vernacular languages to try to replicate the appearance of architecture from a particular region or a particular group of people or belief system, without any of the content and context that you would need to make those spaces meaningful. And that happens in a lot of places. You know, there's all kinds of cities in North America, for example, where companies will save the facade of a historic building and just build a, you know, a commercial center in behind it. So there's none of the technology or the inherent knowledge about what that space was used for 150 years ago. It's just the physical bricks that are pasted back onto a, you know, a steel frame behind it. So I think this is something worth considering in a number of different ways. The next question that I would like to touch on is this idea of your thoughts on the move to embrace certain elements of regional designs, which is directly connected to what we were just speaking about. So the Aga Khan Awards has been instrumental in recognizing design practices since the 70s that really embrace regional styles of architecture and the technologies of those regions as well. But in the context of both practice and scholarship, how do we see these priorities emphasized in the digital humanities? And what are your general thoughts about this, the different iterations of reviving and trying to preserve vernacular architectures? Yeah, Saman, would you like to begin because you have some direct experience with the Aga Khan Awards? It would be nice to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I think it's one of the great things that has been happening is because of this award, then it becomes a tendency to pay attention to certain way of thinking, and certain approaches that has led to the preservation and regeneration and renovation within some of the local techniques. So for sure, I think it's a great thing, but I'm not sure if it has really influenced the mainstream way of architecture in any of these locations. It's kind of its own category. It's kind of its own style. And I do believe that there is a shift that's happening in most recent, maybe the last decade or so, not because of, I mean, Aga Khan has been there for many, many years and it has played its role, but also because there has been a shift in the global scene of architecture towards community-based thinking, towards environmental thinking, and vernacular is not separate from environmental and community-based thinking. So I do think like there is a hopeful shift, there is a hopeful attention that's being paid to this way of thinking, also in the so-called Islamic world, but and I do think that Aga Khan has played a big role. But as I mentioned, I think like we should look for ways, like is there a way within education or within the way that we introduce vernacular, like back to the first question about definition, that can shift it from this way of thinking that, it's only for a particular way of design that's not necessarily economic, or I mean, economic, but not profitable, like profit-based, for example. So how can that kind of shift happen? I think is at least a big question for me.
So, Lehman, would you like to respond to
that? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Just piggybacking off of Yasaman's point, I think incentivizing projects and programs has shown significant proof, and I have actually seen it like firsthand. In Afghanistan, like for instance, Aga Khan has been engaged and involved with development projects. They had a specific division, Aga Khan Development Network, that had a trust fund under it, and they've actually been pretty vocal, publishing projects, awards, and it has actually been impactful in the way buildings or monuments are actually currently designed. So one example that I wanted to mention here is, for instance, and this is actually a garden which was actually very close to where I lived back in Kabul, a Babur garden. Again, this was an investment by Aga Khan. So originally, the Babur garden goes back to the 16th century. that was actually essentially built by Mughal Emperor Babur. So this garden actually holds significant historical and cultural value, obviously. However, and again, another obvious reasons, because of the years of war and conflict, it has been deteriorated. Ever since 2002, Khan has been engaged and initiated actually a comprehensive rehabilitation of this project to essentially restore its identity and former glory. I also wanted to mention that bringing such projects back to life not only revitalizes the historic landmark, but also actually provides employment opportunities from economic standpoint to the people that are around. It sort of like brings back the trade workers that have that knowledge, like stone workers, brick workers, and whatnot. I've actually witnessed like a couple of my friends, when they were working on this project, they were looking for this and that name that like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there was a Mason here. Can we go and find out if that person is still alive, or if there's like the relatives that they actually took over that institutional memory, and then we can bring them and utilize them in the projects. So there's been, Our Khan's role has significantly been instrumental in these projects. But again, in the realm of scholarship and digital humanities, I also want to say that Our Khan did a great job. I have been a beneficiary of some workshops, seminars that has been facilitated by them. I guess I'll conclude there.
Yeah, I'm of two minds. I once started training as an architect, and I really respond to using the vernacular as a source of inspiration for the present and rooting a contemporary architectural imagination there. But as an architectural historian doing field research, wandering around Delhi, I saw great disconnects, like Yasaman's alluding to. That in some ways, it seems like a very limited subculture that is only affecting a very privileged few. And maybe that's where these changes have to start. But without a way of mainstreaming the conversation at the vernacular, and without thinking about how the intangible side of vernacular architecture, I fear that it's a conversation that is really absent in the most important circles.
These are such important points, and there's some dark irony in the fact that architecture that is made for the people by the people that are going to be using it is slowly being made into a kind of an elite commodity that is not accessible to the wider community. So I wonder if Suleiman and Yasaman worked on a school project in Afghanistan. I wonder if you would like to maybe talk about your experience working on that project and how that connects to what we've been discussing.
Sure. Yeah, that was actually a great experience. So Yasaman and I actually, so just like big picture, there was a collaborative effort between University of Washington, School of Built Environment, an international organization, nonprofit organization that's actually based here in Seattle, Sahara Education, and the then Ministry of Education in Afghanistan. This project came to life in late 2012, where the conversations around the design of that project initiated, and I was actually onboarded, Yasaman before me. So yeah, I think it goes back to from a project, a construction project delivery standpoint. I think it was the integrated design built model that actually facilitated bringing different minds and different perspectives around the same table. When I was actually back home at that point of time, I traveled to northern Afghanistan a couple of times, essentially to meet with locals, to identify the material that we could potentially benefit, that we ended up embedding them in the design. For instance, brick masonry was actually a prominent example that I recall. So it was just those conversations that eventually led to a project that actually it turned out to receive AIA's honor award in I believe it was 2018. But again, going back to the vernacular aspect of it, I guess just bringing those different trade workers and their expertise, engaging them in the design and benefiting from their viewpoint has been instrumental in the success of that project. Yasaman, feel free to add many other things since you have been engaged in the design process for that project.
Yeah, of course. I think it's very interesting to talk about the project because, I mean, because also there were so many challenges regarding this communication that was happening between the team that was in the US and what was happening in Afghanistan, mainly how to engage the community and like that, because also the funding for the project was being provided by a non-for-profit based in the US. So I think for both of us, for Suleiman and me, it was a big question of, okay, what, because, you know, when we talk about vernacular, of course, techniques and material is a big part of it, but a lot of it is also about all the elements that are decided and all the layers that are put together to form a project. And we were so curious about like the decisions that had been made and to find out whether it was really something that the community needed. Because when you're, for example, designing a school in the US, the community is involved from the beginning and every decision has to be tested and weighed in by the users, by the teachers. And also there's very, very important, like certain codes and rules that you need to follow. And I think that the interesting challenge, which was also the exciting part about this project, was this collaboration. And we ended up doing a post-occupancy evaluation, which we finished in 2022, and a lot happened in between while we were working on that. But we tried to ask questions about this, about, you know, are those design decisions that were made really the things that the students needed? And some of them were, and many of them were not. So I think this is maybe a little bit different from our discussion here, but it does relate to the idea of communication between the Islamic world and the rest of the world. And when we talk about these sorts of collaborations and what kind of community exchange can be formed from the beginning to basically, you know, approach any project in any setting in a similar way. If there are certain codes, it's because of safety, it's because of many ideas that have been tested. So it's important to you know, to think about what if there are no codes. You know, what happens? Like, what is the role of architect? Ethically, it's a very different question. So yeah, I think, you know, maybe that's a different topic, but it has been a very interesting experience to go over and go through that post-occupancy evaluation.
If we're thinking about the vernacular as an expression of people's communities and of traditions of knowledge that are passed down through families and ways of living and being, then this is really an essential component of approaching design for communities, because consultations between people from different cultural backgrounds result in very different interpretations of needs and information. And so this is a really interesting question that you've raised about how, those embedded ways of being, of social practices, of expectations for behavior that are just understood rather than needing to be explained to, a foreign construction company or consultancy is really, I think, maybe the next step in thinking about how vernacular architectures are going to be expressed through global economic relationships, like funding from the Aga Khan program. In fact, my next question is how do neoliberal economics or nationalism or other isms like pan-Islamism play a role in the rejection or loss or preservation of vernacular design references, in shifting vernaculars, and in the reappropriation of local traditions, or as Yasaman pointed out, the importation of traditions from other regions to replace what has been lost locally, and in need-based construction of infrastructure and housing. And then how does the vernacular become a point of pride, and when are vernacular references misused in projects? So Hussein, would you like to start thinking about that?
Sure. I think I was alluding to some of my experiences in Delhi, where I would be in old Delhi, Shah Jahanabad, and I would be invited into some homes. They were newly constructed structures around old structures, and old structures were actually being illegally appropriated and absorbed into these newer structures. And I think this is all part of the post-partition politics, the Hindu nationalist politics of Delhi. These were Hindu families expanding presence in old Delhi. So the it became it's deeply enmeshed in the politics of the city, the politics of the nation, the conservation of the vernacular urban fabric. Um, Elsewhere, I saw historical sites occupied by the homeless and unhoused, people who've been so marginalized by society, and they had no refuge but except these just like they had been abandoned by their societies, the structures had been abandoned, and they found a meeting, a place, and a way to help each other. But obviously, the structures were put at risk through fire and defacement, etc. But at the same time, they were serving a value, a purpose, right? Safety, providing safety, shelter for people who needed it the most. So I think the short answer is that we just like we can't separate the intangible from the tangible, we also can't separate the conversation of the vernacular from questions of political economy as well.
Suleiman, would you like to take that on?
Yeah, when it comes to isms, I'm like, ooh, and there's a lot of them, right? Hussein mentioned about the political implications. I kind of wanted to pause on the economic implications, essentially. So when we talk about new liberal principles in the context of construction in general, we talk about efficiency, we talk about cost cutting, we talk about customization, we talk about modular. And when we talk about all like cost-driven techniques, to me, it kind of like marginalizes vernacular practices, if that makes sense. I do believe that there's an intersection between vernacular architecture and neoliberalism, if you will, which is feasible and also beneficial to both the end users and the designers and builders. So the real question is like, how is it possible? It's again, I want to go back to the communication, open communication, engagement of different parties that are essentially involved in building any monument, any structure and whatnot. So that engagement aspect of it is essentially really important. I guess I just wanted to allude to as we were alluding earlier, the example of Gohar Khatun Girls School. I think with all the challenges that Yosaman mentioned, the opportunities on the other hand was like, yes, the communication turned out to be a challenge and a risk that essentially impacted the cost, the schedule and whatnot. But again, the end product turned out to be something very close to what has been crafted in the minds of the architects, essentially. First, and also secondly, it addressed the need of these students that it was actually meant to be serving them. I guess that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think continue. I think I might use an example to talk about that, because this is something that I have learned about recently and it's very interesting for me. So there is a local mortar that you find in different parts of Iran. It's called sarouj, and it's used in using different methodologies in different regions based on the material that you find there. And it would be used to put bricks together, to put the stones together. And it has been the main way of building for hundreds and thousands of years in many cases. So, and you have structures that still work very well in very strong earthquakes, which are connected using this mortar. But what happens is that after industrialization and what is imported in Iran about 70 years ago, suddenly there is massive production of cement, and it's used, it's imported and imposed upon all the communities. And then this way of thinking also is imposed that cement is new, is modern, it's contemporary. So in the local, when you talk with local builders, even though they might tell you, okay, sarouj lasts for 500 years, cement lasts for 50 years, but we have to use cement because cement is the way of building in the modern sense. It's the way that we can be known. It's the way that we can create that image. So I think it's very important to, think about this idea of efficiency and what it really means and who is it for. Is it more efficient for the communities? It's more efficient for the local builders, or is it more efficient for, the way that, of course, we define it in neoliberalism? Is it more efficient for mass production, for quick production, for something that's not about timelessness? It's not about generations. That's why, you can go to a space that has been built at 1,000 years ago and it's still functioning the way that it was. It's still alive. It's not, just a monument that you look at. So I think there's, so many points that can be discussed about why this has happened in different communities. And it's, of course, not only in the Islamic world, but there's also the other aspect that I find it very interesting is the way that modernism is defined in the Islamic world versus how it's defined in the Western world. The way that, you read about, for example, Bauhaus, or you read about the start of modern architecture, it's not separate from craft. It's about continuation of craft, connecting the craft to the technology of the day, and then reinterpretation and regeneration and finding new techniques. But then what's found in that part of the world is imposed or imported in another part without going through that idea of connection between the local craft and what's found now.
So again, connecting everything to context and use and place. So let's return maybe to the question of when vernacular, whether it's through process or technology or decorative programs, is a point of pride, and when it becomes maybe misused or maybe not used to its best in its best way. Yasaman, would you like to continue?
Yes, sure. I think the reason that it becomes a point of pride mainly is because it works. It's because of quality, because it can really respond to what the needs of the users. And it really needs time, right? So sometimes it might be a point of pride for a year or for a few years, but it really needs to be studied for a decade, to see what happens to what's created. But I think it's really about quality.
Hussein, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm also exposed to the work of the Aga Khan Foundation in the Delhi area, in the Nizamuddin Humayun's tomb area. And their vernacular skills were cultivated for local small-scale monument restoration, and it seems like it depends which community you're talking about, right? So some communities will see it as a point of pride that there's a heritage site that's been conserved and is an attraction and elevates the community from the perception of being an impoverished area to an elevated area. Others are disconnected, right? That the vernacular work is only for heritage work, but it has little relevance to the Eastern, mansions in Nizamuddin East, for example. And there, the discourses of modernity coexist with, the vernacular, and they don't seem to intersect. So it seems like it's a multivariate kind of signification depending on the audience and their relationship to the traditional architecture. I'm still sorting through it in my head.
So I actually agree with what Yasaman and Hussein mentioned. Obviously, there's an value proposition as it relates to quality. There is a value position to elevating the economics of that local region. I also want to say that vernacular architecture can also be seen as a double-edged sword. What I mean by that is, like, obviously good quality, obviously sometimes efficiency, meeting the local needs, reinforcing cultural identity and heritage. These are the good stuff that we can talk about it. But again, on the other hand, we can also say that we cannot argue that vernacular can also be misused or exclusionary when it's actually appropriated without genuine understanding. Then if it's not genuine, then the risk is essentially becoming a superficial aesthetic rather than a living monument. So I think it's very tricky. One other point that I wanted to mention is that project donors and project sponsors also have a big say in what projects could be essentially implemented and not. And I've actually witnessed that, experienced that firsthand. they may sometimes reject the vernacular patterns, the vernacular designs. And the real scheme of real estate and construction, it's unfortunately, it's very money driven. And I think that's why investors and donors, they have a big say. This design is accepted, this design is not accepted. And then the risk would be essentially marginalizing vernacular practices in favor of sometimes globalized and standardized design patterns. But again, we can talk about this for some time. I just want to be cognizant of time.
Thank you. And I'm reminded of interesting ways of reinterpreting vernacular designs and patterning too. You know, there's a lot of, for example, you know, concrete apartment buildings in different places across Anatolia, for example, and in the Turkish Republic, where either the builders or the people who are the owners of the apartments in the building will decorate the facade with tiles in patterns that reflect local carpet weaving traditions and make references to other things. Or people in rural communities will sometimes still use whitewash and ochre to paint the outsides of their houses. And so there's localized ways of personalizing what are otherwise fairly generic building types with vernacular references that can also be quite interesting. I want to shift our conversation a little bit to think about not just the historic spaces or references to historic design, but actually the way that people adapt and use their own spaces, which might be, you know, social housing complexes or, you know, sort of multi-level apartment buildings. But based on your own design and research and your engineering work and your research experiences in the field, how do you think that different groups, whether they're children or the elderly or women or marginalized denominations or migrants, or as Hussein mentioned, people living in homelessness, how do they adapt space for their own uses and engage with the everyday elements of architecture? Because most neighborhoods that you can go to that have, you know, Islamic communities, they have changed the entrances to their homes. They've cordoned off spaces for everyday needs like laundry, and they have made communal spaces to help the kind of community oversight of children. And so there's all kinds of different ways that people shape their own spaces, and I would like to hear what your thoughts about that. Hussein, would you like to start?
Sure. As I mentioned, we saw the appropriation of small-scale tombs for temporary accommodations by women and children. The homes in Old Delhi that I witnessed absorbing historic architecture, the historic parts were often used for storage as places to warehouse things. So because they require kind of more maintenance or they're less livable or more investment in them, so they become just this uncared for storage spaces. I think I'll leave it at those two quick observations.
Yes, Saman, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, sure. You know, I think for sure, like any other group, like any user will try to form the space based on their needs as much as they can. So it's really the reflection of the power that they have. Like if they have a lot of power, they can change it more. If they're more marginalized, and if they have access, so in places, for example, where like minority groups can access or can define even monumental buildings, they're going to change it. And I think we hear it a lot in many architectural stories when architects talk about, oh, they built something in a certain way and then they go back after 20 years and then they find such and such change and they feel so disappointed, versus it would change no matter what. So it's like sometimes the role that the architect is like sees for themselves might be they might take it too seriously, but at the end it's really the space for the people, and they're going to do whatever they need to do with it, and they're going to change it. And I think maybe it's about the way we see architecture as like this fixed image, sometimes like really this ego based fixed image that's not going to change. Even when we create renderings, we're going to remove all the people or just put a few, or remove all the life from it, and just look at it as even if it's a house, we might just look at it as a monument when we publish it. But in reality, that's really not how the spaces are used or taken care of or changed over time.
I was also gonna say, as I was reading this question, I was thinking in my head. So one observation, one example that comes to my mind is the courtyards, essentially uh, back home, where essentially when it comes to, I remember there was a project that I used to work on. It was supposed to be a boarding school. We have completed the design, but it unfortunately never turned out to be a reality. So courtyards are essentially these spaces where uh, study groups are formed there. It could be utilized for multiple different reasons. It could be utilized as a playground. It could be used as a walking space. Obviously, these courtyards are the way that they are designed is like they're open to the sky. So a great place to absorb some sun during the winter days. And obviously on sunny summer days, it offers shadows that kind of like could be utilized on different purposes. That was the only example that actually came to my mind.
And that's such an interesting example too, because the design of the courtyard is what makes it such a multi-purpose space. So perhaps that's an element, that has been thought through and tried and tested for so long that that's how they have arrived at that particular form of housing, which is, pretty prevalent across most of Western Asia and other areas as well.
Excuse
So
me.
yes.
I wanted to ask a quick question of Suleiman. In Delhi and Lucknow, I've witnessed courtyards be repurposed as basically for parking or for scooters or bicycles. I'm just wondering if you have seen that as well.
Yeah, I've actually seen that quite a lot when I traveled to India. So a matter of fact, I actually studied my bachelor's in India, and when I actually went to India, that was actually kind of like an interesting because the way it was utilized back in Afghanistan was slightly different as opposed to how people utilized it. But again, there was another area that courtiers could be used in that big list or menu of purposes.
So Hussein, in terms of purpose, vernacular purpose versus historic architecture, is that the new vernacular purpose of a courtyard, do you think, in crowded urban spaces where people can't find place to put their cars? Is that the new vernacular purpose of that setting?
Some would argue that courtyards did also house historic modes of transportation. So it's a continuation, right? Instead of your horse or your camel or your donkey. um, but yeah, I mean, I see the great shift is the move towards verticality because of the densification of the urban environment, and that has led. There are, of course, examples in the Islamic world of dense urban formations, but and multi-story housing. But I think, especially in South Asia, that well, depending what period you're talking about, that transition to densification and which languages of the vernacular you mobilize in that effort become its own kind of design problem.
Can I just add a quick point to what Hussein mentioned? I think when we talk about communities, and this is something that I've actually witnessed in dense populated spaces. So when we talk about spaces or communities modifying their spaces, I think what really originates that modification is the necessity, the aspect of it. And obviously, when there is something that needs to be addressed, it's going to be a matter of cost, an added cost. And sometimes I've noticed that some communities are less capable of adding additional square feet to their existing footprint. And that's why one particular space within the whatever that square footage is, it could be utilized as a multi-purpose space, if you will.
So the last question that I have for you today kind of takes the architects and the engineers out of the equation. And so I wonder about this a lot and the occupants of buildings are sometimes their builders, or at least they're spatial curators. So what we were talking about earlier, and using space for purposes that that the original designers might not have had in mind. Communities add components or take them away according to need and resources. And this is not always something that's mediated by professional architects or appreciated by them, or even recognizable to historians. This is a question that I come up against quite a lot, because we look at space as a physical, the design of space is in its physical properties, but it's very difficult to see what happens in a temporary nature or when things are reconfigured over time. So my final question to you is, or questions, what should designers and historians of architecture consider regarding the interventions of users and that they make to their own spaces? And how can we identify and understand the role of user-built and user-adapted spaces, especially over time when there's not a lot of evidence for all of the different configurations that these spaces have gone through, and especially thinking about some of the traditional materials like mud brick that are repaired over time fairly seamlessly to integrate with the original structure. How can we look at those kinds of questions? Hussein, why don't we begin with you?
Yeah, the thing that comes to my mind is can we categorize the types of typical modifications? And I've often seen lighting, space, cooling, like storage space. And it seems to me that some kind of anticipatory design that allows for the fact that these things will be needed and that there's a modularity to it. In terms of the conservation of historical spaces and the modifications that are made to those, I think a vocabulary or a language of modification, I think, needs to be established, or maybe useful. I guess what it poses to me is a question I'd pose to my colleagues here is what kinds of resources would you find useful from the world of architectural historians that would aid you in your advocacy and your for the vernacular in its various manifestations?
Yeah, Saman, would you like to take that on?
Yes, sure. I think for me, also, with what you added, Hossein, I think for me, it adds maybe to even a more basic question of the way we define the role of architects or the role of architecture, and if that definition is still relevant. For example, is it relevant that we are only looking at monumental outcomes, as I mentioned, even for historic renovations, or even for just building a house? This is the way that we are defining the outcome of architecture and what we are looking for. But if we think of architecture as the way we shape or we influence how the built environment and the unbuilt environment is shaped, if it's about the relationship, the spatial relationship of the users and their environment, if it becomes more focused on that in definition, then the way we would define architectural projects would completely shift. And I think it is happening in different ways, even if we don't want it to happen. It is happening because of necessity, as Suleiman mentioned too, because we are facing environmental crisis, we are facing economic crisis, and because people at the same time we are looking for more equity. We are people have a voice now that maybe they didn't have 100 years ago, in the same way. And that's why we have defined UN goals, like the 17 goals that needs to be reached. So if those needs to be reached, we can't really, if we limits the role of architecture only to those monumental creation, we are basically removing the role of architecture, I think. So I more see it as a shift of thinking in the way that we define what architecture is, and can it be more about the process of how the relationship of people and their environment is elevated or changed or improved.
Yeah, I guess lots of great points has been discussed, and I don't think I have much to add. The only point that I wanted to bring up as I was thinking about this is we cannot essentially put the building occupants, which are essentially the end users of any architectural product, out of the equation. And with that said, I kind of want to play devil's advocate and say that the whole responsibility is on the shoulders of the architects, essentially because of the importance of their role in the whole design process from conception until implementation. And basically having a balance between what the need is and working with architects has been a great experience for me, but sometimes I've heard ideas which are sometimes less feasible. How can we reach our bridge? And I'm looking at architects now. So it's been actually a great conversation that I had over time with architects, making sure that that's a great idea. It meets the need of the occupants. But again, let's talk about constructability and some realities on the ground. So I guess with that, I would end it.
Thank you all so much. This has been such an interesting and I think important conversation that brings together a lot of really meaningful ideas about not just kind of the final iteration of built space, but Yasaman mentioned the complete exchange of knowledge, and Suleiman talked about the generational transfer of knowledge, and Hussein brought up a lot of points about the political context in which architecture is created, and all of these things play a huge role in how communities live with space, and what people who care about designing good space do with the knowledge that they have, whether they've inherited it through, you know, their family lineage, or whether they've gone to architecture school to train as a designer, or they've become an engineer or an architectural historian. And so, you know, thinking about all of these things, I think is really the job of people who work in any aspect of architecture, in order to create meaningful work, whether it's the history of art, looking at the history of architecture, or the built space itself. So I hope that this inspires future conversations, and I look forward to working with all of you again in the future. I really enjoyed our talk today, and I appreciate your time being here with us. And you can look for the publication of the transcript in the International Journal of Islamic Architecture in the future. So thank you very much, everybody.